Hello, good morning. In today's video, we are going to talk about one of the new component in VPC called Nat Devices. So far, we have seen about different other components in VPC like Internet Gateway, route tables, subnets, and IP addresses, what is CIDR block. Today, we're going to talk about Nat Devices. Although Nat Devices is an optional component, but we will see what purpose it serves in a VPC. Let us revisit what we have learned in our previous video. Let's assume you have a VPC of IP address range 10.0.0.0/16, and then I create public subnets and private subnets in different availability zones, and I give a different range of IP address to each of these subnets, and I choose to host my web application in a public subnet and a database in my private subnet, and I also have a router and an internet gateway, and the request from my web application will be routed to the internet gateway via the router, and the router will know where to route the request based on the route table. So we have discussed all of these in our previous video. Now say for example you have a database which is being hosted in your private subnet, and it has to download or update its patches via the internet. So when it has to download or update the patches, it has to connect to the internet. As we all know that the internet gateway opens up the connection to the internet, any instances which is hosted in a private subnet need something similar to internet gateway. So for that purpose, we have NAT devices. So these NAT devices are hosted in one of our public subnets, and we also create an elastic IP and we associate an elastic IP to these NAT devices. Now let's assume like in one of our public subnets, we host our NAT devices. Let's assume your NAT devices has been hosted in a public subnet and you assign a particular elastic IP to your NAT devices. So when your private subnet wants to connect to the internet, it will route the request to the NAT devices via the route table. So the request will flow to your router, and the router will send the request to the corresponding NAT devices through the route table. So this is how even in our previous videos we have seen the router will send the request to the internet gateway based on the route table. If the destination or the target column in the route table is internet gateway, it will send that, or it will divert the traffic to its corresponding internet gateway. Same logic if the particular IP address of the private subnet and if the target of that corresponding IP address is the NAT devices, then it will redirect the traffic to the NAT devices. NAT devices, once it gets the traffic, it will open up the connection to the internet. It will send the request to download the patches, and once it gets the response back, it will redirect the response back to the private subnet or the database which is hosted in your private subnet. So far so good. We have understood the purpose of a NAT devices. Now NAT devices also does one more important thing. What it does is when it receives a request, it masks the original IP address of the source, and it represents its own elastic IP address of the as the source to the internet. Say for example the IP address of your database is 10.0.20.5, and once the request is diverted to the NAT devices, the NAT devices will represent its own IP address as the source and it will expose to the internet. So why does it do that? Because if any hacker is trying to access the IP address of the database, it will not be able to do so. It will only see the elastic IP address of the NAT devices as the source or the requester. So that is why we call NAT devices as a network trans. So we call that as a network address translation because it translates the IP address of the original source to its own elastic IP addresses. Now you might ask, like when we already have an internet gateway which opens up the connection to the internet, then why do we need a NAT device? Now friends, the basic difference between internet gateway and a NAT device is the internet gateway opens up two-way communication, right? Both the inbound and the outbound is open to the internet. Whereas in case of NAT devices, it could only send a request to the internet, but it cannot be accessed over the internet. It is just one-way communication. these IP addresses cannot be accessed by anybody over the internet. Whereas in case of internet gateway, your web application has to be accessed over the internet through its IP address. So that's where the IP address, the internet gateway opens up two-way communication, whereas the NAT devices opens one-way communication. Now all your NAT devices, now there are two kinds of NAT devices. One is a NAT instance, another is a NAT gateway. Irrespective of what you're planning to use, it has to be hosted in a public subnet and it has to be associated with an elastic IP addresses. Now let us see the different types of NAT devices. One is a NAT gateway, another is a NAT instance. NAT instance is managed by the customer themselves, whereas a NAT gateway is a fully managed service by AWS. So you don't have to um, worry about the administrative efforts, whereas if you're planning to host through a NAT instance, then it requires a lot of configuration. NAT gateway is basically used when there's a requirement of a higher bandwidth, but in case of very less internet requirement, you can probably prefer to use a NAT instance. Now, in case of both NAT instance and NAT gateway, you need to have an elastic IP address attached to it, and it has to be hosted in a public subnet. Now, this is another image from the AWS documentation. As you can see, this particular VPC has two different subnets. One is a public and a private, and the NAT devices is hosted in one of the public subnet. In both the cases, whether you're planning to have a NAT gateway or a NAT instance, you host that in a public subnet and you associate your device with an elastic IP address. Now, when your database server sends a request to open up to the internet, the router sends the redirects the request to the NAT devices via the route table. So in the route table, you have to specify to redirect the request to a particular NAT gateway ID. So if you actually see the main route table, so all the requests from the private subnet will be redirected to the NAT gateway ID. And from the NAT gateway ID, it masks the IP address of the original source and it represents its own elastic IP address as a source to the internet. Both NAT instance and NAT gateway has the same role, it performs the same task, but there are certain differences. Like if you have a requirement where you need to download where you need a higher bandwidth of internet, you would preferably go for a NAT gateway. It also has a lot of advantages, like it is fully managed and you don't have to worry about managing and configuring your NAT gateway or a NAT instances. And your NAT gateway is also highly available, and your NAT instance is not as stable as compared to your gateway. So there are always a certain advantages since it is managed by the AWS, like it is highly available and it is less configurable. So you can enjoy all those benefits if you choose to use a NAT gateway, right? Now these are some of the very basic differences which we have seen and we have already discussed. What is the main purpose of a NAT devices? So let us revise on whatever we have discussed till now. So NAT device is basically used when you have to open up your internet connection to any instances which is hosted on a private subnet. It is a one-way communication, which means that it can communicate to the internet, but you cannot access your device, your EC2 instances in a private subnet over the internet. And the NAT devices translates the IP address and it represents its own elastic IP address as a source to the internet, and it is fully managed, whereas NAT instances for that matter is managed by the customer. So it has its own advantages and disadvantages, where NAT gateway gives you highly available, less configuration, fully managed, highly available. So all those jargons which you see in AWS, NAT gateway provides you all those things. So friends, we have seen about the NAT devices. So in the next topic, we'll be talking about a different component in VPC. Until then, goodbye.